For today's example, inshallah, what we're going to be jumping into is actually the third chapter of the Qur'an, Surah Al-Imran, a chapter of the Qur'an that really talks about archetypes of individuals and families that were obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what were their characteristics. And it's actually in the 103rd ayah in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together, وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. And don't be divided. And in this, we get one of the most consistent images in the Qur'an and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the idea of holding on to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's an example in the way that, of course, this is not talking about a literal rope, but oftentimes what does the path, the Sunnah of the Messenger ﷺ, what do the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Qur'an, look like in a person's life, that they look like this rope that you can hold on to. And when would you hold on to a rope? It's like this imagery, and it would be when you need to get out of a dangerous situation. You hold on to a rope so that you can be pulled up to safety. That's one. And also, what do you use a rope for if you're holding on to it? It's usually to climb. And to really understand this metaphor properly of what is the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and why do we need the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah says jami'an, all together, and in it is the key word as to what this rope really will do for humanity. And it's this idea that humanity will be raised and elevated all together only if they hold on to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if they don't, they're actually going to splinter and separate into their different ways. To appreciate this, we look at another example in the Qur'an that's called the example of the people of Babel, or the Tower of Babel. It's found in the Qur'an as a reference, but it's also found in our cousin traditions in Christianity and Judaism, with this idea that the Tower of Babel was this tower that was being built by humanity. And in the biblical version, it says in order for them to see God, and in the Torah, actually, in the Hebrew version, it says in order to become gods. And what the people did is they wanted to construct a giant tower together. And as they constructed it, it was to say, well, we can just become gods ourselves. We no longer have to rely on God. And then God punishes them in the Bible with a very interesting punishment, in which God causes all of them to splinter and they start speaking different languages to the point that they can't speak to each other anymore. So that they leave this this initiative and they all go their different ways. And in our tradition, the punishment always fits the crime. And what was happening here is, as they were trying to replace God, what ended up happening? They could no longer connect with each other either, versus the Quranic archetype. So they have this idea of a tower that was being built, and the bigger it gets, the less they can communicate with each other. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gives the opposite example of the one who holds on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's going to be, because they hold on to the rope of Allah together, that as they hold on to it, they all raise collectively. That the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what will give human beings the ability to collectively build a society that once you abandon it, once you abandon the idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the idea of God, society is doomed. And this actually is an interesting verse because it's the conclusion that even secular thinkers have gotten to. The famous example of the philosopher Nietzsche, he says that God is dead and we have killed him. It's a very blasphemous statement, but what he says next is interesting, and society is doomed as a result, because he realized that the fundamental thing that keeps human society together was this idea that we are all working towards God, working towards this unimaginable good, that doing so together actually allows society to function and we all benefit as a result. It's this rope that elevates us. But once that is taken away, once there's no longer the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people have nothing to keep together with. And that's why in today's society, sometimes you'll see splintering groups take place where two people can't even talk to each other anymore, where basic terms of what is good, what is bad, can't be determined. What are we working towards? Everyone has their own idea, and tolerance becomes the highest virtue. Rather than in our tradition, what was the highest virtue is actually getting closer to God, is actually taqwa, God consciousness. But that's really what's represented by this metaphor. Hold on to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together, وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا فِي, and don't be divided. وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ, and remember the favor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. You used to be enemies, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes your hearts to actually become together. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ. By the favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of you became ikhwanan, brothers. This idea that how does human society stay together is when they hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together. It creates for them a direction and a means of elevation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that hold on fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen.